Greetings and welcome to This is Revolution. My name is Jean Badgelan, in for Jason Miles tonight, who is taking a well-earned rest. Now, before we begin with our show today, I want to remind everybody to like and subscribe. Your likes and your subscriptions really help us in the algorithm. There's also the bell, apparently, that works, I'm told. Leave a comment. Jason reads all your comments and gets very angry when you send him mean comments. So, send the mean comments because that is excellent conversation material for us. In addition, if you have the means and you enjoy the content, please consider becoming a patron uh, and help us keep producing the interviews we do here at This is Revolution. Now, for this episode, we're going to be discussing Syria, the recent earthquake, the civil war, and the political changes that are taking place in the region and how that is affecting the state of play in Syria, which has been in a state of civil war for over a decade. And I'm joined today by Alex McKeever, who is a freelance journalist. He works on Syria. He's worked with several organizations, including Truth and Justice, working on Syrian human rights. He's a graduate of the CUNY Grad Center of Middle Eastern Studies, and he's also a part-time mover of things as well, as he's based in New York. So I would like to welcome Alex to the show. Hello, Alex. How are you doing?
Hey, doing well. Thanks for having me, Gene. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm really great. I'm really glad to have an opportunity to talk to you about the Syrian civil war because obviously there's a lot of information, there's a lot of narratives, there's a lot of people say a lot of things about Syria, and it is a very complicated civil war. I mean, all civil wars are complicated, but it isn't just one side versus another side. It's, there are multiple different factions. There are international powers involved: Russia, the United States, also Turkey, the Arab countries all have a stake in Syria. And in certain ways, this heavy regional involvement has perpetuated this conflict for more than a decade. And of course, recently, Syria was struck by an earthquake. The epicenter of that earthquake was in Turkey, but of course, um, the affected regions included parts of Syria, which of course, suffer from, not only the earthquake, but also the lack of preparedness because of the civil war, the sanctions, the lack of materials. So there's a heavy human toll of that earthquake. So I thought we might begin our discussion tonight by talking about the earthquake and what has been happening with the earthquake, how that's affected Syrian politics, how the response has been. What are your impressions?
Yeah, so the earthquake occurred on February 6th at like 4 in the morning, 4:17, I believe. And, the epicenter was in Turkey, in Marash, in like central southern Turkey, and immediately had massive effects within Syria, primarily within the northwest, in areas controlled by the opposition and as well by the regime. So, and the opposition, I mean, to immediately jump into how the country is divided, the opposition territories are divided into two different statelets. One is controlled by the group Tahrir Sham, or HTS, which is formerly was Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda affiliate within Syria, and is now the situation's a bit complicated there. We can get into that later, maybe. And then the other part of opposition-controlled Syria is directly, basically controlled by by Turkey. You have Turkish military deployed there. You have various Turkish ministries, different government bodies there. So that the opposition areas were the most affected by the earthquake. In Idlib, that had the biggest death toll altogether. Various towns and cities along the border there, and then the city itself that had the most deaths within opposition-controlled territory was Jandiris, which is within Afrin, the historically Kurdish-controlled area, or Kurdish-populated area that was taken over by Turkey in 2018. So those were the two biggest or most affected areas, and then regime territories within Latakia province and within Aleppo, uh, particularly Aleppo city, were also affected. Altogether, about 5,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and thousands more injured. With thousands of buildings collapsed, and yeah, so it was devastated, and this was exacerbated by the economic and political conditions within the country itself. So areas that are under government control are, the Syrian regime is under sanctions by most of the international community, led by the U.S. and U.K. and EU. Um, so that has some effects on relief, though there are aid carve outs, and pretty quickly the Damascus was receiving fights, particularly from a lot of Arab countries as well as from the UN, because relief through the UN goes to the government of any country. So it got a lot of aid from the UN. In the northwest, in the areas that are under opposition slash Turkish control, these areas really did not receive much aid at all the first couple of days. Part of this was affected by the damage to Turkish infrastructure. So the main road that leads to the main border crossing from Turkey into Syria, into Idlib, that road itself was, sections of it were greatly damaged by the earthquake. And then there's also the issue of aid, UN aid, going into opposition controlled areas. Initially, there was an agreement years ago between, the West, Russia, etc., to allow for multiple crossings of aid, from Turkey and also from Iraq into non-government controlled areas, including some to Kurdish controlled areas in the northeast. Over the years, Russia has used its Security Council veto and as a permanent member to whittle these down to just one crossing. And so several weeks later, the Russia and the Syrian regime okayed the opening of other crossings, but overall, aid's been quite limited into these areas. And
So,
yeah.
sort of the general picture that we see is that these rebel held areas were the most affected, and also had the slowest aid response because of the complicated international and legal status of these regions, and of course, because the main regional patron of these regions, Turkey, had its own internal crisis to deal with as well.
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair to say.
And I should probably also add that these regions are also some of the regions that have seen some of the most fierce fighting during the Civil War as well. So obviously that sort of adds on top of the sort of uh, infrastructural problems that they're facing as well. It's also regions that have been like in constant turmoil all throughout the Civil War. So what has been the political fallout of this earthquake? Are there openings with the opposition? Is aid going through, and is that opening the door for perhaps some kind of reconciliation, or is the status quo still kind of just on the remaining as it was before, with a kind of brief, to use an analogy, a football game at Christmas, like in the First World War, British and German soldiers played football for Christmas Day and then went back to fighting each other. Is this just a brief kind of hiatus? What's the political outcome of this? Will it change anything?
So for the last several years, the conflict's been largely frozen. So I don't. The World War One analogy doesn't necessarily make too much sense. What you do have is sort of random bombardment, going back and forth at different times, particularly coming from the regime and Russian side. But I'd say the largest political development has been the sending of aid by a lot of the Arab countries to the regime, and this has sort of facilitated what was already a slowly developing sort of what appears to be a rapprochement that's in its earliest phases. So initially, before the earthquake, this was being led by the UAE, and Jordan to a lesser extent, but Jordan's obviously not doesn't have the same weight that the UAE does. But since the earthquake, you saw Saudi send its first flights to Damascus since 2011. And actually, in the last week, Saudi has announced that it's inviting, or it's been reported at least, that Saudi is inviting Syria to the Arab League summit in May. So this is, I'd say, that the biggest political development that's occurred following the earthquake is it's given sort of an excuse, or it's kickstarted this nascent normalization of Assad from the Arab League side.
And this was already happening before the earthquake. So the earthquake hasn't so much changed the trajectory of the posture of Arab countries towards Assad, but rather perhaps served as an accelerant for a kind of thawing in relations and at least normalization and sort of reintegrating Syria into the greater Arab political community?
So it's a little difficult to say because the different Arab countries have taken different approaches. Jordan was the first one to really reach out to the regime because after the Syrian government and Russia took back the entirety of opposition-controlled territories within southern Syria, the border was opened with Jordan eventually, and trade began again to some capacity between Jordan and the regime. And yeah, so, and then the UAE has begun that process too. But I do think I wouldn't see it as necessarily one unified bloc. I think countries are sort of following their own rationales. I think now that Saudi is reaching out and engaging in this process, that might put more weight behind it in terms of the entire Arab League. But